Let me ask you something. What would you do if you figured out a way to win, completely legally, completely within the rules, and instead of being celebrated for it, they changed the rules to stop you? Not because you cheated, not because you broke a single regulation, but because you were so far ahead of everyone else that the only way to stop you was to literally rewrite the rulebook. That happened. It happened to one man, one car, one idea that was so correct, so fundamentally right, that the most powerful organization in American drag racing had no choice but to respond. And here's the part that'll stick with you: the car that caused all of this? It wasn't a monster. It wasn't a fire-breathing, ground-shaking big block weapon. It was a compact little economy car. A car that people literally laughed at when it pulled into the pits. A car that had no business beating the factory-backed giants it was lining up against. And it beat them anyway. Over and over and over again. By the end of this video, you're going to understand something about performance, about speed, about engineering, about what it actually takes to win, that most people who call themselves car enthusiasts have never properly understood. And you're going to understand why Bill Jenkins might be the most important figure in the history of drag racing that almost nobody talks about. Stay with me, because this story, it doesn't go where you think it goes. Picture this. It's 1965. You're standing at a drag strip somewhere in Middle America. The sun is beating down on the asphalt. The air tastes like race fuel and burnt rubber. And lining up at the starting line in front of you are the most powerful machines American manufacturers have ever put on four wheels. Chrysler's 426 Hemi, Ford's 427, Pontiac's 421. These are not just engines, these are statements. These are the automotive equivalent of a country flexing its muscles and saying, "Look what we can do." The factories are pouring millions of dollars into these programs. They have engineers, they have test facilities, they have professional drivers, they have unlimited budgets. This is the golden era of factory-backed drag racing, and it is spectacular. And here is the thing nobody is saying out loud in 1965. It isn't working. Oh, the cars are fast. Don't misunderstand me. But they are not as fast as they should be. Not by a long shot. All that money, all those cubic inches, all that engineering talent, and a massive, embarrassing percentage of the power being produced is going absolutely nowhere. It's going up in tire smoke. It's spinning the rear wheels at launch, howling and screaming and putting on a show while the clock keeps running and the advantage bleeds away. Think about what that means for a second. Really think about it. You have built an engine that produces, let's say, 500 horsepower. You've spent months developing it. Thousands of man-hours. Millions of dollars. And at the moment it matters most, at the launch, in those first critical feet where races are decided, a huge chunk of that investment is converting to heat and noise because the tires can't handle it. You've essentially built a machine that destroys its own potential. Now ask yourself, if you were an engineer and you saw this happening, what would you do? Most people in 1965 had one answer: make more power. Push through the traction problem with sheer force. More displacement. More fuel. More everything. The assumption was that eventually the power would overwhelm the problem. Bill Jenkins looked at the same situation and had a completely different answer. He said, what if we stop making the problem worse and start actually solving it? That question, that simple, logical, blindingly obvious question that somehow nobody else was seriously asking, is where this entire story begins. Who is Bill Jenkins? Now before we go any further, I need you to understand who this man actually was. Because the popular version of the Bill Jenkins story, the version that gets told in quick paragraphs in motorsport history books, doesn't do justice to what made him genuinely unusual. Bill Jenkins was not cool in the way that 1960s racing figures were supposed to be cool. He wasn't a smooth-talking showman. He wasn't a charismatic factory representative with a nice suit and a corporate expense account. He was blunt. He was direct. He was demanding. He had exactly zero patience for people who hadn't done their homework. And somewhere along the way, all of this earned him a nickname that followed him for the rest of his career. They called him Grumpy. And here's what I love about that nickname. It tells you everything and nothing at the same time. Yes, he was grumpy. Yes, he was difficult. Yes, he could be abrasive and impatient. But behind all of that was something that the people who actually knew him understood. He was grumpy because he cared. He cared about getting things right. He cared about understanding how things actually worked, not how people assumed they worked. He had no tolerance for shortcuts or guesswork or the kind of, that's just how we do it, thinking that passes for engineering in a lot of racing paddocks. He was an engineer, not a parts changer, not a tuner who turned screws until something felt better. An actual, systematic, first principles engineer who wanted to understand the why behind everything. And here's the thing about people like that. When they find a problem that everyone else has accepted as a fixed condition of reality, they don't accept it. They pull it apart. They look at every assumption that went into it. And very often, they find that what everyone else thought was an inevitable fact of life was actually just a failure of imagination. Jenkins found that the hard traction problem that was crippling big block drag cars was not inevitable. It was not a fixed condition. It was an engineering failure, and engineering failures can be fixed. So he needed a car to fix it in. And this is where he made a choice that, in hindsight, was either insane or genius, and it turned out to be both. He chose a 1966 Chevrolet Chevy II. Let that sink in for a moment. While Chrysler was showing up with Hemis and Ford was rolling out 427 powered Fairlanes, Bill Jenkins, the man who was about to revolutionize super stock drag racing, chose a car that was essentially designed to be a sensible, affordable commuter vehicle for American families. The Chevy II was small. It was light. It was completely unintimidating. When Jenkins arrived at events with it, the reactions ranged from polite confusion to outright laughter. Competitors who were backed by factory money looked at this compact little thing and felt their confidence go up. Which was, of course, exactly the wrong reaction. Jenkins named the car Grumpy's Toy. Think about that name for a second. He called his race car a toy. In an era when drag racing was all about projecting power and menace and factory-backed seriousness, this man named his car a toy. It sounds dismissive. It sounds like he wasn't taking it seriously. It was actually one of the most perfectly calibrated pieces of psychological warfare in the history of motorsport. Because while everyone was laughing at the toy, the man who built it was getting ready to take their lunch money. The problem everyone ignored. Here's a question I want you to sit with for a moment, because the answer is more interesting than you might expect. What actually determines how fast a car goes in a quarter mile? Most people will say horsepower. Some people who know a little more will say power-to-weight ratio. And both of those answers are correct, but they're incomplete, because they ignore the most critical variable of all. What determines how fast a car goes in a quarter mile is not how much power it makes. It's how much of that power actually reaches the ground. And the place where that equation is won or lost is not at the top of the rev range, screaming through the traps at the end of the run. It's in the first 60 feet. Those first 60 feet, the launch, the hit, the moment the clutch drops and everything happens at once, that is where races are decided. And in 1965, 1966, 1967, in the middle of the big block wars, nobody was treating those 60 feet as an engineering problem to be solved. They were treating them as a fact of life to be managed. You launched, you hoped the tires hooked, you corrected if they didn't, and you moved on. It was reactive. It was inconsistent. And it was costing everyone time they didn't even know they were losing. Jenkins saw those 60 feet differently. He didn't see a random, uncontrollable event. He saw a mechanical system. A system with inputs and outputs. A system that could be analyzed, modeled, and optimized. The system where the variables, engine torque, tire loading, weight distribution, chassis flex, were not random. They were the predictable consequences of specific mechanical relationships. And if you could control those mechanical relationships, you could control the outcome. The key variable, the one that Jenkins became obsessed with, was weight transfer. Now I know that term gets thrown around a lot in car conversations, and I want to make sure we're all actually understanding what it means, because when you truly understand it, the genius of what Jenkins did becomes obvious. When you accelerate hard, the front of the car rises and the rear squats. You've seen this. You've felt it if you've ever been in a powerful car. This happens because of inertia. Your body and the car's body want to stay where they are while the wheels try to push you forward, and this creates a rotational force that tilts the car backward. That rearward tilt is weight transfer. Weight is physically moving from the front axle to the rear axle during the launch. And weight on the rear tires means grip. More weight means more grip means more traction means more of your power actually goes somewhere useful. So far, so good. Everyone knew this. This wasn't secret knowledge. Here's what was missing. The amount of weight that transfers and critically, how quickly it transfers and how it loads the tires is not fixed. It is not a constant that you just accept. It is directly determined by the geometry of your suspension, by the specific angles and pivot points of the components that connect your chassis to your wheels. Change the geometry, and you change the weight transfer characteristics. Change the weight transfer characteristics, and you change how the tires are loaded at launch. Change how the tires are loaded, and you change everything. Jenkins changed the geometry. Let me walk you through this carefully, because I genuinely believe this is one of the most elegant pieces of engineering problem-solving in American motorsport history, and I want it to land the way it deserves to. The 1966 Chevy II came from the factory with a suspension system that was designed by engineers whose job was to make the car comfortable, affordable, and reliable for average American consumers. Those engineers were good at their jobs. But their priorities had nothing to do with launching a car as hard and as cleanly as possible from a standing start. So the geometry they chose, the angles, the pivot points, the relationships between the various suspension components, was optimized for road comfort and manufacturing cost, not for traction. Jenkins went back to first principles. In a rear-wheel drive car with leaf springs, which is what the Chevy II had, the rear suspension geometry determines something called the instant center. The instant center is a theoretical point in space that you can calculate based on the angles of your suspension links. It sounds abstract, but it has a very real and very measurable effect on the car's behavior. The relationship between the instant center and the car's center of gravity determines how aggressively and how quickly weight transfers to the rear tires under acceleration. Think of it like a lever. If you want to lift something heavy, where you put the fulcrum, the pivot point, determines how much force you need and how quickly the load moves. Move the fulcrum, and you change the leverage. Jenkins was moving the fulcrum. By modifying the mounting points and angles of the Chevy II's rear suspension, working within what was permissible under the rules, he repositioned the instant center in a way that changed the weight transfer dynamic at launch. The car now loaded the rear tires harder, faster, and more consistently than the factory geometry allowed. The tires were getting the weight they needed to hook precisely when they needed it most. And the result was a launch that looked almost supernatural to people who didn't understand what they were seeing. Here's what it looked like from outside the car. The Chevy II would hit the gas, the rear would squat hard and immediately, and the car would simply drive forward. Planted. While the big block competitors were spinning up and hunting for grip and correcting and then finally catching, Jenkins was already 2 car lengths ahead and pulling. The 60-foot times tell the whole story. Jenkins was running 60-foot times that were inconsistent with the rest of his car's specifications. If you looked at the engine, the tires, the track conditions, and then someone showed you his 60-foot numbers, they wouldn't add up. They'd look like the numbers from a faster, heavier car with more grip. Because in effect, at the moment of launch, he had manufactured more grip than physics suggested he should have. Not by breaking the laws of physics, by understanding them better than anyone else in the paddock. And now I want you to feel something for a second, because I think this deserves a moment of appreciation. This man, working in a shop without the resources of a major factory, without a supercomputer or a simulation program or a team of PhDs, figured out something that the combined engineering talent of Ford, Chrysler, and General Motors had missed, or had seen and not acted on. He looked at the same problem everyone else was looking at, applied rigorous first principles thinking, and found a solution that was sitting right there in the open, waiting for someone to be smart enough and determined enough to find it. That is not a small thing. That is genuinely remarkable. And the fact that his competitors couldn't figure out what he was doing, that they kept tearing down their engines looking for the secret and never finding it because the secret wasn't in the engine, that is the perfect encapsulation of what it means to solve the right problem when everyone else is solving the wrong one. The second secret, valve train mastery. Now I told you earlier that the suspension was only half the story. And I meant it. Because Jenkins was not a one-trick engineer. He understood that fixing the launch problem created a new problem, or more accurately, it exposed a problem that had always been there but hadn't mattered as much when the car was spinning the tires and losing time at the hit. Here's the new problem. Now that the car hooks cleanly, now that all that engine torque is actually going to the wheels from the very first moment, the engine has to deliver. All the way through the run. At high RPM. Under maximum load. Consistently. Every single time. And in the 1960s, high RPM engine reliability was not something you could take for granted. There was a phenomenon called valve float, and it was the quiet killer of many a race run. Here's what valve float is. Your engine's valves, the components that open and close to let air and fuel in and exhaust gases out, are controlled by the camshaft. The cam spins and pushes the valves open through a series of mechanical components. The valve springs then push the valves closed again. This system works beautifully at lower and moderate RPM. But as engine speed increases, the cam starts moving faster and faster. And at some point, the valve springs can't keep up. They literally cannot push the valves closed quickly enough to follow the camshaft profile. The valves start to float, they stop following the cam precisely, they bounce, they don't close completely when they're supposed to. The result is a loss of compression, a loss of power, potential catastrophic engine damage, and, critically, inconsistency. Your engine stops being a reliable machine and starts being an unpredictable one. Jenkins was meticulous about this. Obsessive even by his own standards. He dug into valve spring rates, into retainer weights, into rocker arm geometry, into every component in the valve train that determined whether it stayed stable when the engine was screaming at the top of the rev range. He demanded, that his engine deliver its full potential at high RPM with the same consistency that his suspension delivered at launch. He was not willing to accept that the top end of the run was out of his control. Nothing in the car was out of his control if he understood it well enough. And he got there. His valve train setup was stable where others were floating. His engine kept pulling hard through the traps where competitors' engines were falling apart at the top. You add that to a perfect launch, and you have something genuinely formidable, a car that doesn't just get off the line better than everyone else, but also finishes the run better than everyone else. But here is what I really want you to understand about this. It's not the specific solutions Jenkins found that matter most, it's the approach. He refused to accept any part of the system as a fixed constraint. Launch traction? Solvable. Valve train stability? Solvable. Every loss, every inefficiency, every place where the car's performance fell short of its theoretical potential, Jenkins treated each one as an engineering problem with an engineering solution. Not a fact of life. A problem. And problems have solutions if you're willing to do the work to find them. That mindset is rare. It was rare in 1966 and it's rare now. And it is, more than any specific technical innovation, the real secret of Bill Jenkins. So what happened when you combined a perfectly optimized launch with a valve train that stayed together at high RPM in a lightweight chassis? You got results that didn't make sense to anyone watching from the outside. Jenkins started winning. And not in the fluky, right place, right time way that can be explained away as luck or favorable conditions or a competitor having a bad day. He started winning consistently and systematically in a way that forced people to pay attention. The 60-foot times were the thing that really got under people's skin. Because 60-foot times don't lie. They are the purest measurement of launch performance. How fast does the car cover the first 60 feet from a standing start? And Jenkins' numbers were impossible by conventional wisdom. They were the numbers you'd expect from a car with significantly more power and significantly better tires than his setup appeared to have. Competitors started doing the only logical thing they could think of. They started examining Jenkins' car. Looking for the secret. Assuming it must be in the engine. Maybe the engine is bigger than declared. Maybe there's some fuel trick. Maybe the carburetor is doing something unusual. They looked and they found a small block Chevy that appeared to be exactly what Jenkins said it was. Because the secret wasn't in the engine. It was never in the engine. And this is the moment in the story where I want you to genuinely feel what Jenkins' competitors must have been feeling, because I think it gets overlooked in the telling of this story. Imagine being one of those teams. You have factory backing. You have a bigger budget. You have more horsepower. You have experienced personnel. You are doing everything right by the conventional playbook of 1960s drag racing, and you keep losing to a guy in a Chevy II who calls his car a toy. And you can't find the reason. You've torn down his engine. You've watched his runs from every angle. You understand everything about what he's doing and you still can't explain why he's faster. That is a specific kind of frustrating that goes right to the bone. Because it's not just competitive frustration, it's the unsettling feeling that there is something you don't understand. That the framework you've built your entire approach on might be missing something fundamental. That the guy with less resources who smiles less and talks less and somehow wins more might actually understand something you don't. That feeling, that uncomfortable, status-threatening feeling, is what eventually found its way to the NHRA. Here's a scenario. Be honest. You run a racing organization. One guy, no factory money, no backing, starts beating everyone so consistently that the manufacturers funding your entire sport start complaining. Loudly. What do? The NHRA's answer was weight penalties. Add ballast to cars that win too much. Sounds fair. Competitive balance. Parity for everyone. But here's what those penalties were actually saying underneath. We cannot figure out what you're doing, we cannot explain it, so we are going to punish the result instead of understanding the cause. Jenkins felt that. Deeply. He had identified the problem everyone else ignored. He had done the hard, unglamorous work. He had broken zero rules. And his reward was extra weight so teams with bigger budgets and smaller ideas could keep pace. Was the NHRA wrong? Meritocratically, yes. Obviously. But here's the uncomfortable truth. If Jenkins drove every factory out of the sport might not have survived. Factories leave competitions they can't win. They always have. So the situation was genuinely complicated. And that complexity makes Jenkins' achievement bigger, not smaller. He didn't just beat his competitors. He beat them so completely that the entire structure of organized drag racing had to respond. That's not a racing story. That's history. And he didn't quit. The penalties didn't break him. This was not a man who broke. He adapted. Moved into pro stock. Same obsession, new rules, new competitors. But that specific window with the Chevy II, that was singular. A moment when one man's understanding of physics was ahead of the entire institution governing the sport. Those windows close. They always close. But what couldn't be taken back was the conversation he started. Slowly, quietly, other builders began looking at suspension geometry differently. The 60-foot time became an engineering target. Chassis tuning became a real discipline. Jenkins planted that seed, even when nobody wanted to put his name on it. Now look at a modern pro stock car launching. For tires planted. Chassis squatting perfectly. Teams of engineers, simulation software, wind tunnel data, all working on the same problem Bill Jenkins solved alone in a Pennsylvania shop in 1966. With a notebook and a tape measure. He was right 6 decades before the industry built entire departments to prove him right. And here's what genuinely gets me, the loneliness of it. He shows up with a car people laugh at. He wins. They go home, tear down their engines, find nothing. He wins again. Whispers build. There must be a trick somewhere. And Jenkins knows there's no trick. Just physics. Just understanding. Just the right question when everyone else was asking the wrong one. They were looking in the engine. The answer was never in the engine. Being right in a way others can't see is a specific kind of lonely. Having the rules rewritten around you, not because you cheated, but because you were correct, is validation wrapped in pure frustration. Grumpy. Indeed. But no weight penalty changes what was true. The truth he found, that was out there now. Permanently. In 60-foot times and quiet paddock conversations and the slow shift in how an entire sport thought about performance. That is the legacy. Not the trophies. The changed question. Bill Jenkins. Grumpy's toy. The car the rulebook had to stop because racing couldn't. If this did something for you, hit like, share it, subscribe. The next video makes this one look simple. We're going to the Vega. The chassis that left professional engineers speechless. Numbers that didn't match anything physically possible. Engineering nobody on the record would explain. The Jenkins story was the appetizer. The Vega is the main course. See you there.